My name is Emily Whittaker, and I'm 28 years old. I always thought weddings were supposed to be a celebration of love, the joining of two lives, a moment frozen in time that you could always look back on with joy. I imagined that moment for years, what I would wear, who would cry, the music, the laughter, the speeches, but nothing in all my fantasies prepared me for what actually happened on my wedding day. It started like a dream, the kind you hope never to wake up from. The venue was a charming vineyard tucked into the rolling hills of Napa Valley, framed by golden sun rays and rows of blooming grapevines. I wore the lace gown my late grandmother had picked out with me before she passed. Everything was perfect until my brother Josh took the mic. Josh and I were never particularly close. We were opposites in every way. Where I was quiet and thoughtful, he was loud and charismatic. My parents often joked that he was born to be on a stage, and maybe they were right. But I never imagined he'd use my wedding as a stage for his own ego. The plan had always been that I would give a short speech to thank everyone who helped make our wedding possible, to honor my husband Matt's family, and to say a few heartfelt words about my grandmother, who couldn't be there in person. I had spent weeks writing that speech, practicing it, revising it, rehearsing it in front of the mirror with trembling hands and hopeful eyes. It wasn't grand or funny or flashy, but it was mine. The reception was just beginning when the host announced it was time for the bride's speech. I stepped forward, clutching the folded paper in my hands, my palms slightly damp with nerves. But before I could reach the microphone, Josh was already there. He flashed the crowd one of his dazzling smiles and said, "I figured I'd save my little sister the trouble. She's never been a fan of public speaking, right?" Laughter rippled through the crowd. My smile froze on my face. I reached out instinctively, but my mother gently tugged me back with a shake of her head. "Let him have this," she whispered, as though he were the one getting married. Josh launched into what he called a family roast, telling embarrassing stories from my childhood, mocking my awkward teenage years, even bringing up my failed engagement 5 years ago, the one that had taken me months of therapy to process. The room roared with laughter. I stood still, trying to keep the tears from spilling over, praying someone would intervene, that Matt might step in, that someone, anyone might say, "Josh, this is not your moment." But no one did. I looked at Matt across the room. He wasn't laughing. His jaw was tight, his hand clenched around his glass. He had asked me just a week before, "Are you sure you want your brother giving a speech?" I had reassured him then, telling him I could handle Josh, that it was important to include him even if we weren't close. And now I was regretting every word. After 15 long minutes, Josh finally wrapped up his hijacked monologue with a toast. "Here's to Emily and Matt," he shouted, lifting his glass high. Everyone clapped, cheered, and raised their glasses. Everyone except me. I was frozen in place, blinking back tears as I watched the moment I had dreamed of stolen from me by someone who always thought the spotlight belonged to him. What made it worse was the silence that followed. No one approached me to say, "That was wrong." No one offered to let me speak, to make up for what was lost. My mother hugged Josh tightly, beaming with pride. "You always know how to light up a room," she said, while patting his back. I stood a few feet away, unseen, forgotten. I found myself slipping away from the reception, past the garden where we'd taken our couple photos, past the arch where we had said our vows. I needed air. I needed space. I ended up behind the venue, standing near the catering trucks, hidden by the shadows of the setting sun. And then I heard footsteps. It was Matt. "I'm so sorry," he said, voice low and steady. "It's okay," I whispered, though it wasn't. "It's not your fault." He pulled me into a hug, and I could feel him breathe deeply, like he was trying to hold in all the things he wanted to say. "I have something," he said suddenly. "Something I didn't think we'd need, but now, maybe it's time." I pulled back and looked at him. "What do you mean?" "You recorded a video version of your speech for your grandma, remember, just in case." I nodded slowly. "Yeah, for her hospice nurse to play if she was too tired to watch the live stream. I have a copy, on my phone, and the DJ has the projector." My eyes widened. "You want to play it? Only if you want to," he said. It's your voice. It deserves to be heard. In that moment, something inside me shifted. I had been robbed of my voice once that day. I wouldn't let it happen again. Now let me ask you, what would you have done if you were me? Would you stay quiet to keep the peace, or reclaim your voice no matter the setting? Tell me in the comments. I'd love to hear how you'd handle it. And if this story is pulling at your heart, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories just like this one. The weight of the decision to play my speech hung between Matt and me as we returned to the reception hall. The music had resumed, the energy buzzing as though nothing had happened. Guests were dancing, sipping champagne, and snapping selfies beneath twinkling fairy lights. It was the kind of celebration I had always imagined, yet I felt like a ghost drifting through it, present but unseen. Only Matt's hand in mine grounded me, a silent assurance that something could still be reclaimed. When we reached the DJ booth, Matt pulled the man aside and spoke in hushed tones. The DJ nodded slowly, eyes flicking toward me, then back to Matt. Within minutes, the music faded out mid-song, drawing curious glances from the guests. A hush rippled across the crowd. I stood near the edge of the dance floor, my hands trembling slightly, unsure if I was brave or foolish. Ladies and gentlemen, the DJ voice rang out. The groom has asked to share something special with all of you, something from the bride. The projector screen, which had earlier displayed a slideshow of childhood photos, flickered to life once more. This time, the image that appeared was of me sitting on our living room couch, dressed in a soft lavender blouse, my hair pinned back, my eyes nervous but determined. The version of me on screen held a folded paper in her lap, the speech I had written with so much care. For a heartbeat, the entire room seemed to hold its breath. Hi, everyone. My voice rang out from the speakers. If you're watching this, it means I either couldn't say this in person, or something unexpected happened. Either way, I want to share a few words. I watched from the sidelines as my image looked into the camera, the same way I had practiced so many times in the mirror. But this time it wasn't a rehearsal. This time I had an audience, a real one. I want to begin by thanking all of you who came from near and far to celebrate this day with Matt and me. It means the world. I especially want to thank his family for accepting me not just as Matt's partner, but as someone worthy of their love and respect. Guests turned to watch, silent and attentive. Even Josh, halfway through a second glass of wine, blinked and slowly lowered his drink. I know weddings are about beginnings. I continued on screen, but for me, this day is also about honoring the people who made me who I am. My grandmother, who passed just weeks ago, always believed in the power of quiet strength. She used to say, "Your voice is your signature, Emily. Never let anyone write it for you." I saw my mother stiffen at that line. She looked over at Josh, whose grin was slowly fading. This day was never about being the loudest or the funniest. I said, but about being true to myself, to Matt, and to the future we're building together. So from the bottom of my heart, thank you. You've helped make this day something we'll remember forever. The screen faded to black. The room was silent, and then, slowly, someone began to clap, then another, and another. Soon, the hall was filled with applause, not thunderous like Josh's roast had gotten, but warm, heartfelt, and resonant. It was the kind of appreciation I had hoped for, not because I needed the spotlight, but because I deserved to be heard on my own day. I turned to Matt. He smiled, his eyes a little misty. "You were brilliant," he whispered. My mother approached next, her face unreadable. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but hesitated. Then, to my surprise, she took my hand and squeezed it gently. "That was beautiful," she said. "Your grandmother would have been so proud." It wasn't quite an apology, but it was the closest I had ever received from her. I nodded, my heart softening. Josh, however, stood several feet away, clearly shaken. His usual confidence faltered as he glanced around at the guests who were now murmuring praise for my words. I could see the internal struggle behind his eyes. He walked toward me slowly, rubbing the back of his neck. He said quietly, I didn't think it'd matter. You always hated public speaking, and I thought I was helping. I didn't mean to steal your moment. I looked at him, searching for sincerity. For the first time in years, his voice wasn't booming with bravado. It was uncertain. I didn't need help, Josh. I said, voice calm but firm. I needed support. There's a difference. He looked down, nodding. I guess I didn't realize that. I paused, letting the silence sit between us. It wasn't just a speech to me. It was a piece of who I am. Josh glanced back toward the screen that now sat black and quiet. Yeah, I see that now. I really messed up, didn't I? I didn't say yes. I didn't need to. The fact that he was finally recognizing it was enough for now. The rest of the night unfolded with a new energy. The guests who had laughed at Josh's roast now approached me with genuine warmth. Strangers told me how moved they were. Friends hugged me tight and whispered, "That was so you." I danced with Matt under the stars, my head resting against his chest, the music finally feeling like it belonged. It wasn't the wedding I had planned, but in some strange way, it had become more honest, more real. That night, after all the guests had left and we collapsed onto the hotel bed, Matt turned to me and said, "You know, I think your grandma would have been proud of how you handled everything." I smiled, tears pricking the corners of my eyes. "I hope so." He kissed my forehead. "You found your voice tonight, and it was unforgettable. If you've ever had someone try to silence your moment, I'd love to know. How did you take it back?" Share your story in the comments. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel if this story resonated with you. Because your voice, it matters, more than you know. The weeks following the wedding passed in a blur of thank you notes, candid photo uploads, and occasional awkward family group chats that danced around what had happened with Josh. Though the air had somewhat cleared, the moment still hung like a ghost in the corner of the room. Seen, felt, but unspoken. I wasn't sure what my brother was thinking in the aftermath. He hadn't called. No long texts, no attempt at reparation, and though a part of me wanted to leave it there, untouched and closed like a sealed box, another part of me itched for clarity, for closure. Matt had returned to work a few days after our mini honeymoon, and I dove back into editing projects, hoping routine would dissolve the lingering tension, but it didn't, not really. My thoughts kept looping back to the silence from Josh. He was never silent. That alone told me everything. One evening, while sorting through our wedding gifts, I came across an envelope with no name on the front. Inside was a simple handwritten note. "I want to talk, if you're ready, Josh." The next Saturday, I drove to our parents' house where Josh had invited me for lunch. I hadn't been there in weeks. As I pulled up to the driveway, I saw his car already parked. My palms grew clammy on the steering wheel, but I gathered myself and stepped out. He greeted me at the front porch, no grand gestures, just a quiet nod and the kind of smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Thanks for coming," he said. "Let's talk." I replied, walking past him and into the house I'd grown up in, where childhood memories clashed with present-day discomfort. We sat at the kitchen table. Just the two of us, no audience, no distractions. He'd prepared lunch, or at least ordered it and plated it himself, judging by the telltale containers hidden in the trash. Still, it was an effort, an olive branch if not a gourmet one. He cleared his throat. "I've been thinking about that night, a lot, more than you probably believe." I said nothing, letting the silence stretch until he continued. "I thought I was doing you a favor, honestly. I thought gets overwhelmed with crowds. I'll take the stage, keep it fun, keep it moving. But I watched your video later, the one Matt played, and for the first time, I realized what I stole from you." My fork paused midair. That was the first time he had acknowledged it out loud. "I took your voice, your moment, and it wasn't mine to take." He said quietly, looking directly at me, "I didn't just overshadow you. I silenced you." The words hung in the air between us, heavier than anything he had said before. "You always do that, Josh," I said finally. "You take over the room, the joke, the conversation. And for a long time I let you. But that night it wasn't your stage." "I know," he said, voice small. And I was wrong, truly. I stared at my brother, the one who had tormented me with teasing through middle school, dismissed my opinions at family dinners, and hijacked my wedding speech without thinking twice. But in that moment, he wasn't the brash, self-assured sibling I had grown up resenting. He was someone who had finally come face to face with his blind spots. I never gave you credit either, he added after a pause. For your career, your choices, your relationship with Matt, I just always assumed. I don't know that I had it more figured out. I raised an eyebrow, because you were louder. He laughed softly, a touch embarrassed. Maybe, yeah, but it doesn't mean I was right. It was strange how quiet the house was, like it, too, was holding its breath. I want to fix this, he said. Not just because I feel guilty, but because I miss having a real relationship with you. Not one based on liners and digs, but actual respect. I looked down at my plate. You can't undo what happened, Josh, but owning it, that matters more than you know. I'd like to make it right, he said publicly, if you'll let me. I blinked. Publicly? He nodded. There's a fundraiser coming up. You're doing that digital campaign video, right? Let me be a part of it. But behind the scenes, I'll write the press piece, highlight your work. No punchlines, no ego, just truth. It was such a surprising gesture that I nearly laughed, but I saw the seriousness in his eyes. He meant it. For once, it wasn't about performance. It was about rebuilding trust. I'll think about it, I said carefully, not ready to give him full rein but open enough to recognize this was his version of growth, and that had to count for something. When I stood up to leave, he walked me to the door. He said, just before I stepped outside, thank you for giving me a second chance. I gave him a small, genuine smile. You're still on probation. He grinned, fair enough. Back in the car, I sat quietly for a long moment before turning the key. It wasn't a dramatic confrontation. There had been no yelling or crying, but in that quiet, careful conversation, I felt a shift, a slow unraveling of years of rivalry and one-upmanship. It wasn't complete healing, but it was a beginning. When I told Matt later, he nodded thoughtfully. You know, I always hoped Josh would learn to see you, not as the quiet one, but as the grounded one. I smiled. Maybe he's finally starting to. In that moment, I felt something loosen in my chest, a knot that had been there for years. It was okay to take up space, to be heard, and perhaps even more powerfully, to be heard by those who once refused to listen. The next few weeks unfolded in ways I never could have anticipated. Josh, for once, stuck to his word. True to his promise, he joined the campaign effort for the non-profit I'd been working with, not as a face or spokesperson, but behind the curtain, researching, editing, and writing copy under my guidance. There was something surreal about watching my older brother, who once mocked my love for meaningful digital storytelling, now ask for my notes and adjust wording based on my suggestions. He listened, truly listened, without interrupting or over-explaining. And the result, the campaign turned out to be the most successful one the organization had ever run. One afternoon, while reviewing drafts for the press release that would accompany the campaign video, I noticed something different. At the bottom of the article, Josh had written a brief closing paragraph that surprised me. Emily Walker's commitment to authentic storytelling not only elevated our mission, but reminded us all that true leadership sometimes speaks softly and still moves mountains. I stared at the words for a long time. It was simple, but packed with recognition I had longed for not just as a sister, but as a professional. No joke, no sarcasm, just respect. I didn't say anything to him immediately, but that paragraph stayed with me. Quiet validation, the kind I'd once craved loudly. The final version of the video launched with a small premiere event organized by the nonprofit. It wasn't a red carpet affair, but it meant the world to me. Matt stood beside me, my ever-steady anchor, and our closest friends and colleagues gathered around. As the lights dimmed and the opening credits rolled, I spotted my parents sitting in the second row. Even they, who had spent much of my childhood doting on Josh and expecting me to tone down the tech stuff, were clapping, proud and visibly impressed. It was the first time I'd seen them beam about something I had done, not because it looked good on paper, but because it touched people. Josh had insisted he didn't want to be introduced that night. He said he preferred to just enjoy the show quietly, so I didn't call his name during my speech, though I did thank a collaborator who challenged me in ways I never expected, and helped me grow stronger because of it. He smiled when I looked his way, nodding like he knew exactly who I meant. After the event, while chatting with the executive director of the nonprofit, Josh pulled me aside. "You were incredible up there," he said, sincerity woven into every word. "People respect you, Em. They should. I should have, a long time ago." I exhaled softly, the weight of those words landing gently instead of painfully. "Thank you," I said. "You don't need to keep saying it, though." "I'm not saying it to erase what happened," he replied. "I'm saying it because I'm learning not to be the loudest voice in the room all the time. Sometimes the most important voice is the one we almost missed." That night, after the celebration ended and the venue lights dimmed, I sat in the back seat of Matt's car, watching the city lights blur past the windows. My fingers played with the small silver charm bracelet Matt had gifted me on our honeymoon, a reminder of beginnings, of chapters yet to be written, and this felt like a new chapter, one not centered on rivalry or validation, but growth. Self-respect, peace at home. Matt poured us both a glass of wine. We curled up on the couch, and he asked, "Did it feel like closure?" I paused, thinking it over. "Maybe not closure," I said slowly, "but it felt like balance, like the scales are finally starting to level." He nodded, wrapping his arm around my shoulders. "He respects you now. More importantly," I said, "I respect myself now, in a way I didn't before." In the following days, things returned to a quiet normal. I went back to my work projects. Josh took on new writing gigs, some even in collaboration with people I had recommended him to. We weren't suddenly best friends, but we had found a rhythm, a sort of mutual understanding that didn't require constant effort to maintain. One evening, while out with Matt at a friend's birthday dinner, someone asked how my wedding had gone. Matt chuckled, and I gave him a look that said, "Don't you dare tell them." But he did, laughing through the entire story, the stolen speech, the surprise video, the shocked faces in the crowd. Everyone roared with laughter, and by the end of it, one woman said, "Honestly, that's a movie ending." "More like a new beginning," I replied. The story no longer stung. It didn't carry the same ache it once did. Instead, it had become a turning point, a place where I stood up for myself, used my voice, and refused to be reduced to a footnote in someone else's moment. A week later, Josh texted me, "Want to grab coffee? No campaign talk, just siblings." I smiled. I replied with a simple, "Sure, my treat, just don't try to give a toast." As we sat in that coffee shop, sipping lattes and talking about nothing in particular, I realized something powerful. Rebuilding a relationship wasn't about rewriting the past. It was about showing up differently in the present, and Josh was doing that. I was too. We talked about future projects, his evolving writing style, my upcoming nonprofit collaborations, and even our childhood memories. For the first time, they didn't feel like battles fought or milestones missed. They felt like lessons, ones we'd both finally started to learn. That night, as I journaled in bed, I wrote a single sentence at the bottom of the page. "Some voices are quiet, not because they are weak, but because they are saving their strength for when it truly matters." And when it mattered most, mine had been heard. There's something sobering and beautiful about realizing that your worth is not defined by applause, recognition, or how loudly your story is told by others, but by how firmly you stand in your truth, even when no one is clapping. For so many years, I had confused silence with invisibility. I had mistaken being overlooked as a reflection of my own inadequacy, rather than a failure of those who couldn't, or wouldn't, see me. But when my wedding day came, and I chose not to shout, not to argue, not to publicly wrestle the spotlight from my brother, I took a different kind of power into my hands, quiet power, strategic power. The kind that doesn't ask for permission. It would have been easy, satisfying even to have made a scene at the reception, to demand that the microphone be handed back, to embarrass Josh in front of everyone, just as he had tried to overshadow me. But that version of justice would have been short-lived. Instead, I let my voice speak on its own terms, in my own time. Through the video I had prepared, I said everything I had to say without raising my voice or lowering my dignity. And that, ultimately, is what changed everything. For anyone who's ever been talked over, dismissed, or robbed of a moment they worked so hard to create, you know the feeling. It's not just anger, it's heartbreak. It's the sting of being erased, even momentarily, by someone who should have protected your light, not dimmed it. In my case, it was my own brother, and while that betrayal hurt, it taught me one of the most valuable lessons I've ever learned. Silence can be a weapon, but so can grace. When I watched the reaction of the audience, of my friends, colleagues, even my family, as they heard my recorded words and saw the photos and stories only I could have shared, I realized something profound. They were not just learning about my love for Matt, or our story, or our journey. They were witnessing my refusal to be sidelined. I didn't have to shout to reclaim my narrative. I just had to prepare. And in that preparation, I discovered a version of myself I hadn't met before. Not the girl who always kept the peace, not the sister who made room for everyone else, but the woman who knew her story mattered, and made sure it was told. In the weeks that followed, I noticed a change, not only in how others treated me, but in how I treated myself. I began speaking up more in meetings. I pitched ideas with more confidence. I corrected people when they misattributed my work. And I stopped apologizing for the space I occupied. It was liberating, and slowly, the people around me started to follow suit. Even Josh, whose relationship with me had once been marked by rivalry and dominance, had started to change. Not because I demanded it, but because I modeled it. I showed him, not told him, what leadership looks like. People think justice always comes with loud declarations and dramatic confrontations. Sometimes it does. But sometimes justice is a quiet whisper in a crowded room, a video played when no one expected it, a moment reclaimed not with anger, but with calm certainty. Sometimes justice is knowing who you are, even when others try to define you differently. I've learned that healing doesn't come from revenge. It comes from clarity, from boundaries, from no longer needing someone else's apology to validate your own experience. Josh did eventually apologize, and it mattered. But what mattered more was that I didn't wait for it. I didn't let his actions define mine. That's where the true victory lies. This story isn't just about a wedding speech or a stolen spotlight. It's about reclaiming your voice after it's been buried under years of someone else's version of who you are. It's about finding the courage to speak, not when it's convenient or safe, but when it's necessary, and doing it in a way that aligns with your values. To every person reading or listening to this who's ever been silenced, shamed, or sidelined, know this: you do not need permission to matter. You do not need validation to be valuable. And you do not need a louder voice, just a clearer one that speaks when it counts, one that refuses to disappear. If you're standing at the edge of a moment where you feel unseen or disrespected, pause, breathe, and ask yourself, what story do I want to tell when this is over? What version of myself do I want to remember? Because it's not just about winning the moment. It's about walking away proud of how you showed up. Looking back now, I don't remember the anger. I remember the pride. I remember the moment Matt squeezed my hand as my video played and my words filled the room. I remember the tears in the eyes of my parents. I remember Josh's face, not defensive or smug, but stunned, humbled, and eventually grateful. I remember reclaiming the space that was always mine and doing it on my terms. Your voice has power, even when others try to take your mic, even when they write over your lines, even when they think they're the main character in your story. Speak, not to shout over them, but to rise above them, because sometimes the best revenge isn't a speech, it's a story well told. And now I turn it over to you. Have you ever had your moment stolen? By a sibling, a friend, a colleague? How did you take your voice back? Share your story in the comments. I'd love to hear how you found your way back to the mic. And if this story resonated with you, give it a like, subscribe to the channel, and don't forget to share it with someone who needs to be reminded. Your story matters, and your voice deserves to be heard. Thank you for listening.